Erin Jenne is professor and chair at the International Relations Department at Central European University and specializes in ethnic conflict, minority politics, nationalism, populism, foreign policy analysis, and qualitative and mixed methods. Impressively, she's held a MacArthur Fellowship at Stanford, a Belfer Fellowship at Harvard, and a Brodel Fellowship at the European University Institute. Her first book, Ethnic Bargaining, The Paradox of Minority Empowerment, with Cornell University Press, won the Mershon Center's Edgar S. Furness Book Award. She's published very widely in academic journals, too many things to enumerate here, including our own Nations and Nationalism. And she'll be speaking to us today on the title, I'm just checking to make sure it's still correct, these things change, The Rise of Sovereigntism in an Age of Crisis. And so, with that, I hand you over to Erin Jenne.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much to Jonathan, David, and other organizers of the conference for inviting me to give a lecture about my work here. I'm very excited to be here with you. Get this a little bit. Okay, so today I want to talk to you about sovereigntism. And I do so with the understanding that this is not a very common or widely used term compared to nationalism and ethnicity. But I hope that this talk will convince you that this actually deserves some look, some examination in the real world. Okay, so the title, as Jonathan said, is The Rise of Sovereigntism in an Age of Crisis. And I begin with some general questions, which I'm sure are not only questions that I have asked, but you are probably also asking. What do we make of the recent rise of revolutionary chief executives around the world over the past 15 years? So I don't need to kind of list out all of them. You're kind of very familiar with Viktor Orban here in Hungary, Donald Trump in the US, Boris Johnson earlier in the UK, Narendra Modi in India, Rodrigo Duterte in Philippines. There's something going on, right, that is leading to kind of an emergence and growth of these types of leaders. Earlier, I think the focus was mostly on the ways in which they talk, which I'm going to talk about. But we can also see, contra some earlier sort of statements by, for example, theorists of populism, that things that they say are not just words for elections, for electioneering, for popularity in order to maintain power, but they also actually have impacts in the policy world. So here are some few, just a very kind of small short list of a few impacts that we can see. Beginning in the 2010s, largely out of the media limelight, Viktor Orban totally overhauled the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with mass firings and then injecting his own kind of allied minister into the ministry, which was retitled the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And rejected the EU migration quotas. There's a long list of the things that he has done, particularly since 2014 and going forward and after the migration crisis. We're not going to focus on him today, although he will be part of the story. In the 2010s, also during the same period, Nikola Gruevski in North Macedonia began a complete restructuring of the North Macedonian foreign affairs. After 2016, the UK exited the EU and introduced significant immigration restrictions. And then most famously, Donald Trump 1 and 2, because we have to talk about 1 and 2, in the first term instituted a Muslim travel ban, which was overturned, began construction on a wall with Mexico, introduced tariffs on China, renegotiated the terms of NAFTA, and pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords and the TPP agreement. In just the first few months of his second term, he has already pulled out of the World Health Organization, the UN Human Rights Council, started a trade war with China, ended USAID, and began to cull diplomats and other federal employees. What is going on here, right? We have to talk about this. We have to talk about the actual real policy impacts of these ideologues. What does this all mean? I would argue that this has everything to do with sovereigntism. And what I further argue, and here comes nationalism and populism, that populism and nationalism provide the momentum, the motivation, and the direction of sovereigntist movements. And these are defined as collective campaigns of self-governance for an idealized political community. They are most likely to emerge in the wake of events that generate crises. These are critical junctures or Leclerc ruptures, at which point popular demands for a new kind of political leadership to address perceived gaps in the exercise of sovereignty emerge. Okay, so I'm going to now unpack this argument, beginning with Jacques Lacan, who is a psychoanalyst. And he argued that the imaginary is one of three intersecting orders that structure human existence. So it's getting quite sort of psychology-based here. The others are the real, which encompasses or embodies one's experience with the real world, and the symbolic, which is kind of the language or the symbols that we use to make sense of our world. So the imaginary, in many important ways, comes before the symbolic. He argued that the imaginary emerges through the so-called mirror effect. And this is a stage in child development by which children make sense of their fragmented and alienated egos by seeking an integrated self in the mirror. So I want you to kind of sit with this idea for a second. This very, very important moment by which a child comes into the world and starts to form the concept of I. Okay? The mirror, in this sense, serves as the imaginary order, or kind of like a big other, where we project our fantasy image of a unified self. Through this imaginary coherent self in the mirror, we try to integrate our fragmented and alienated egos. And this is a very important point that Lacan tried to address as well. He said that this mirror effect is not only experienced in childhood, but actually extends through our life. He says that our egos are constantly trying to bridge the fragmented experience of self in the real, in the realm of the real world, and with the idealized image of the self in the mirror. Okay. So this brings me to imaginary sovereign order. So this is kind of the link between sort of the psychoanalytic theory, which is, very much focused on the self, and the international world. So Charles Taylor, he kind of also was drawing on Lacan, and he defined the social imaginary as the ways that people imagine their social existence, how they fit together with others, how things go on between them and their fellows, and so on. The logic of the social imaginary can be extended to the IR realm through the concept of sovereignty. And here I want to reference Kevin Olson's book on sovereign imaginaries. So the shape of the sovereign imaginary does a number of functions for us. It establishes the rules of political governance, the preferred modes of international engagement, the dominant political agenda and values, the identity of the political class, and the legitimate sources of political knowledge. If you will, it is a kind of vehicle that defends and promotes the self in the political world, right? So the self also requires a kind of a sovereign imaginary. Okay. So let's return to nationalism and populism. How do they fit into this? The argument here is that they work as orthogonal sovereign frames. And so the way that I'm thinking about nationalism and populism is quite similar to the ways that Michael Friedan has talked about nationalism, and also Casmuda, as thin ideologies. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with these conceptions, very well-known theorists of nationalism and populism, right? So in other words, and to draw on Friedrich Barth, or to paraphrase him, they are more important for the boundaries that they create than the cultural stuff they enclose, right? So they are boundary-making technologies that perform a spatial function in the real world. So what they do, in short, is to reframe or reduce, in the case of sovereigntism, the height and breadth of this sovereign imaginary. And again, this is all kind of illusory, right? These are things that sort of exist in this imaginary world. So, and here this kind of draws on the work of Benjamin Decleen and Jenne Stavrakakis, who I'm sure that many of you are also familiar with, who talked about nationalism as a kind of an in-out antagonistic discourse, and populism as this up-down antagonistic discourse. And so there's this kind of two-dimensional sort of mapping that they introduce in their work. Okay, and my argument is that this reframing of this imaginary occurs in response to perceived threats to the sovereign community, these crises, these Laclauan ruptures. Okay, so this is an image that I published in an article from 2018, and it kind of summarizes the logics here. If you actually, I should also point out that the horizontal kind of in-out sort of sphere that you see there, this actually comes from Andreas Wimmer's work from 2002. And the way to think about this is that you have this kind of the darker sort of core is kind of the in-group, the national in-group, right? And then you have a kind of a lighter sort of outer sphere that's maybe ethnic minorities. And then further on, you have maybe immigrants. And I included a dash to indicate how porous or penetrable the sovereignty is, like how easily people can transverse these boundaries, okay? And if it's very tightly inscribed, this is a very kind of like ethno-nationalist type of imaginary. If it's very broadly inscribed, this gets closer to quite a cosmopolitan type of identity. By contrast, this up-down is more this sort of populism versus liberalism. Liberalism basically allows for elites to be within the idealized sovereign imaginary. So this is the distance between the ruling class and the people on the ground. Populism wants to reframe the sovereign imaginary to get low to the people, to get rid of the elites, to exclude them from the idealized political community. Likewise, when you're doing ethno-nationalist reframing, you're excluding national others from the idealized political community. And what you end up having is a quite small idealized sovereignty. Okay, so this is what I'm talking about. These are the excluded groups from this kind of smaller, resized, reframed sovereign imaginary. Okay, and I'm gonna get back to this elite and national others because they are inscribed in narratives of ethnopopulism, which I'm going to get back to and define later on. Okay, so this was published a couple years ago in an ISR, some big, with many authors. These are kind of idealized, constructed types of sovereign imaginaries, and you can just kind of think of it as globalized sovereign imaginaries where you have, very high and very wide, liberal cosmopolitanism, right? So this is involved in global governance ideals, this notion that national boundaries are maybe kind of porous, maybe they're overlapping, maybe they're not so tight, right? And that also there's multiple kind of layers of governance, not only at the national level, but at the international level. So all this work on global governance or EU governance kind of encompasses this. This is the kind of globalized sovereign imaginary. And when you're particularizing in the course of sovereigntism, you're calling for a quite small sovereign imaginary, something that's low to the people, right? Something that is mediated typically by this kind of revolutionary populist leader, delinked from global governance structures, and also tightly inscribed nationally with hard boundaries. And it might even involve deportations, right? To kind of make it more of a homogenous, a nationally homogenous imaginary. So in other words, these policies are essentially used in order to achieve a closer alignment between the real and the imaginary. Okay. This is something that I published. I feel like this is like a tour of self-promotion for all of my publications, but all of these things do work together, and this is kind of how I'm thinking about these theories or concepts step by step. So this is something that I published about COVID, and this kind of gives you a sense of how it might look, a liberal nationalist sovereign imaginary being kind of higher and maybe even a little bit wider than an ethnopopulist or nationalist populist sovereign imaginary, right? So you can kind of see how they scale differently. And my argument at the time was that you had these kind of liberal nationalist imaginaries that were shaping responses to the COVID epidemic. And you had these kind of ethnopopulist, nationalist, populist imaginaries that were shaping responses to the COVID pandemic. And you can actually see this in political artwork, which is one of my favorite kind of forays into this type of work. I don't know if you guys remember Andrew Cuomo. But he, before he was forced to resign in disgrace, he was kind of the guy, right? The kind of like New York governor who was going to, kick the butt of the COVID pandemic. And this is one of his posters that he published, and I got permission to reproduce this in my article. And you can kind of see that you have this what I would call a kind of a liberal nationalist imaginary, sovereign imaginary, where you have, all this sort of multi-ethnic group of people who were workers and nurses and teachers and, sanitation workers and people who were working together as a team in order to manage the pandemic. And this thing that they're pulling, this rope, is kind of, we're pulling the curve down. If you remember the curve of, feels like ancient history now, but the curve of infections, right, had to be lower in order for all of us to kind of get out of our apartments and join the actual real world. So this is kind of, we're all kind of working together to do this, and there's all these kinds of, you should get tested, you should wear your mask, so you can see these kinds of icons in this image here. But you can also see that there are threats outside of New York or the US, right, which included, on the left, 3 million Europeans coming in from Europe and bringing the COVID with them, so that has to be managed there. So, we got to do some kind of border management, right? So that it indicates that the borders do matter. We have to kind of come together collectively as Americans to manage this. And, we have to be more restrictive in, who we kind of let in because we have to, again, keep the curve down. But you know, it's kind of a happy picture, it's kind of collaborative, it's multi-ethnic, and by contrast, so this is a political cartoon by Ben Garrison, who also gave me permission to reproduce this in the article. And if you're interested, he is kind of, he's the best, I think, at kind of providing imagery for the sovereign imaginary that Trump and Bannon and all of these kind of Trump-associated ideologues are promoting. And so I want to draw your attention to a few things, obviously foremost of which is that China's doing everything. China's responsible for everything. China's a big danger. That's all this kind of orientalizing sort of imagery here, where they're also crushing Hong Kong and Falun Gong, right? You have the Tiananmen Square. But what I think is very, very interesting is who is standing on the Great Wall of Murder. I don't know if you can see these images. The people on the Great Wall of Murder include the Clintons and Kissinger, which is kind of funny, right? Kissinger is part of the liberal elite, a global elite. He's one of the globalists. And they're working in cahoots with China. So this, I hope, recalls the national others and elites, right, that are working together in order to subjugate, you know, the national self, right? So you see these types of images again and again in these types of cartoons of, you know, people, these sort of national traitors, really, or my favorite Hungarian word, idegen szívű, foreign-hearted. I think that kind of illustrates this quite well. They're part of the national group, but they're not part of us, right? They're working with their foreign enablers, right? And that makes them very, very threatening. We have to do something about them, okay? So, okay, to return, this move from globalized to particularized sovereignties that goes along with this kind of movement of sovereigntism, how does this work, right? Because we're all kind of thinking about this in our own individual minds, right? But now we're scaling up collectively to a wider society. So how does that work, right? So the argument is that this shift from a self that is large and inclusive, this globalized sovereign imaginary, to one that is small and exclusive, this is where nationalism and populism comes back into the picture. Nationalism comes to the fore during external sovereign crises that involve migration, ethnic conflict, borders, and so on. And populism, by contrast, comes to the fore during internal sovereign crises that include debt default, economic collapse, ruling party scandals. So to think about it kind of in another way, it's a crisis of, you know, external self-determination versus a crisis of internal self-determination, right? You have this kind of Janus-faced notion of sovereignty that involves both parts, right? And the chief executive is basically acting at the hinge, providing for both of these, both internal and external sovereignty, right? And this movement from globalized to particularized sovereignties occurs when a broad swath of individuals no longer see themselves or their values mirrored in, here comes the mirror back into the picture, the liberal cosmopolitan sovereignty. So they become alienated from this globalized reflection. They are convinced that they are on the cusp of a coming political transformation. And they're motivated by the urge to reconcile the gap between their real experiences of anomie with an imaginary unified self. So these are very happy and excited kind of movements. If you talk to Trump supporters, which I recently have, they're really happy, despite all of the seeming chaos that, that we see from the outside. This is not how Trump supporters are experiencing it from the inside. Okay. Okay, and there's a lot of words up here, but these are mostly quotes. And I want to give you a sense of the differences between a sort of a purely populist and a purely nationalist discourse, right? So, and this is where we link it to foreign policy action, which basically this is revisionism, right? Acts that are intended to fundamentally revise the character of relations between one state and the international order, or the international other, foreign others, okay? So populist imaginaries are at bottom revolutionary and anti-establishment. In foreign policy, they select for systemic revisionism, so a fundamental restructuring of the system itself, and you can see this on both the right and the left. And so for examples, and this, if you're interested, we have also coded hundreds and hundreds of chief executive speeches, and these are some of the excerpts, right, that sort of illustrate a purely populist kind of quote, right? So this is Vladimir Mečiar in 1994, involved in this kind of dispute over kind of the election result of 1994. And he said he disputed the right to leadership for those who have been failing for years for the sake of people who have been failing for years in programs and who have built up the whole program only on hatred, disowning people, lying, provoking affairs, afraid, many unsubstantiated raids, waiting for foreign representatives or foreign media or foreign business sphere to come to the Slovakia to win the election for them. So this is mostly about the political opposition. Okay, so it's really mostly about how the government has failed, how the previous leaders have failed, and how he is going to ensure that there's no more failure in this political system. So he's kind of more on the right. You have then also Bernie Sanders, never a chief executive, but I think he kind of personifies this kind of left-wing populism, where he says in 2015, this campaign is about transforming America. It's about ending a campaign finance system which is corrupt and allows billionaires to buy elections. It is about creating an economy that works for all of us, not just the 1%. It is about ending the disgrace that millions of undocumented people continue to live in fear and are exploited every day and in their jobs because they have no legal rights, right? So here, again, it's the elites. But it's not the political elites, it's the economic elites. And that's the characteristic kind of difference between the left and right populism, right? And they're both calling for systemic revisionism, right? A change to the system, the way that we do things in politics. Nationalism, on the other hand, calls for lateral revisionism. So basically kind of a change in relations, typically with the neighbors, right? With borders, perhaps. It can be combined with the systemic revisionism, but not necessarily. So there can be this sort of pure nationalism, right? So Stephen Harper, I'm just going to give you this quote, in 2012 on the site of, this is basically an Arctic expedition site, Nanook 12, says, our sovereignty, our presence, and our ability to project the presence everywhere we place our flag, that is where you come in. You are part of a determined expansion that we are making to our sovereign presence in the Arctic. We also remain determined to assert our national interest, right? So this is about kind of Canada's borders. It's about Canada's claims to the Arctic. And you see some kind of expansionist language in there as well, which suggests a kind of revisionism, right? But there's no populism. There's no kind of systemic, these traitors, we have to change. We have to get these bad guys out. It's just, we got to kind of regulate on our borders. Now, the fun part happens when these two things come together in what I call ethnopopulism. A way of thinking about this is fifth columnism. Maybe some of you might know Harris Milanis and Scott Gates. They have an edited volume on fifth columnism. basically, and how this has played out in many, many different cases and over different historical periods. So what ethnopopulist imaginaries do is that they involve, first of all, perceptions of both internal and external sovereign threats working in concert, colluding, conspiring against the pure people, the nation people, the core people, right, the proper people, right? In Hungary's, Viktor Orban's Hungary in 2014, so quite a while ago, in Tusnádföldő, he said, on the one hand, there are millions of us with a nationalist sentiment, while on the other is the global elite. They want to take our country away. And then he said again in 2017, George Soros and his NGOs want to transport 1 million migrants to the EU per year. So you have this elite, this Hungarian, but he's kind of a traitor, right? He's working together with these global institutions, with his network of NGOs. So there's a lot of kind of anti-Semitic kind of tropes that you can kind of hear here. To basically resettle all of these non-Hungarians into Hungary and dilute the Hungarian national identity, basically destroy the Hungarian nation. Okay, so this is, some of you I'm sure are familiar with the Great Replacement Theory. It's not dissimilar to that. Okay, this is Erdogan after the attempted 2016 coup. He said, enemies of our nation got exhausted in the morning of July 16th, seeing this unity of people. This nation does not accept enslavement. We must analyze the July 15 coup attempt very carefully. We should not only evaluate those who have done this betrayal, but also the powers behind them and the motives that motivate them. Okay. There was also, I should mention, Donald Trump just published this Easter message, right, where he basically says, Happy Easter to all of these left-wing lunatics who want to bring these murders and MS-13 and, you know, all of these gang people into America. So you see this trope again and again, these elites who are not loyal to the nation, cooperating with globalist institutions to bring in migrants, to bring in national others, to destroy the nation. So this is ethnopopulism. Okay, so I don't want to go into a huge amount of detail here, but just to say that you might be familiar with the work on foreign policy analysis, so basically populist foreign policy, nationalist foreign policy. What are these things? How do these discourses affect foreign policy? And there are different theories, and you kind of have the same set of theories for both populism and nationalism. You have this notion that it's ideas that are pushing everything forward. A kind of an inside-out notion of how populism and nationalism influence policy, not just domestic, but also foreign policy. Then you have the supply-side theories, so the folks who say that it's basically elites that are driven by motivations for personal self-aggrandizement to gain or maintain power. Right? And they're using these nationalism and populism as tools in order to maintain power. But this doesn't necessarily influence so much policy in the long term, because really what they're after is power. So may or may not have an impact. And then you have the demand side theories that basically said, no, it starts with the people. It starts with the people, and they develop this kind of demand for particular leaders to come into power and enact the policies that they want, right? So it's kind of like top down, bottom up versus inside out, okay? And my thinking on all of this is that they all work together. And this is another, this comes from another, comes from a handbook on foreign policy that, you know, I'm not going to go too much into detail here, but just to say that you start with a status quo policy, in this case a foreign policy, then you have some kind of crisis, This might evoke threats of either external, internal, sovereign threat, or both. And if it is internal, this leads to populist mobilization. Here's where the elites come into the picture. If it's external, it leads to nationalist mobilization. Again, elites come into the picture. You could have them combined. And then the effects are basically, if it's populist, then you have this conflict with allies, with international organizations. Maybe internally you have conflicts with the opposition party and their organs. If it's on the bottom with the nationalist mobilization, it's mostly conflicts with regional actors and borders. If it's ethnopopulist, this can lead to omni-revisionism, omni-conflict, where basically there's conflict with everyone. Conflict with global international organs, conflict with neighbors, conflict in every realm that you can think of. And I think that this basically summarizes what the current Trump administration is doing right now. Okay, this I'm not, again, going to go into I'm going to just show you a few slides at this point because we're almost at the end here. But this is a mapping of our speech database. And if you're interested, I can talk to you individually or in the Q&A about how we measured all this stuff. I also have some extra slides on this. But this is just to give you a sense. These arrows are basically in the lower left-hand corner. This is like very low levels of populism and nationalism. And most of the chief executives fit within this lower left-hand quadrant. Then you have the nationalist, not populist. Here you have the populist, not nationalist. There were many that were more nationalist than populist. It was, until recently, relatively uncommon to have populist chief executives, right? Most of them are much more nationalist than populist. But these arrows, the orange arrow is basically Erdogan. From the beginning of the 2000s until the last one that was coded was the late 2010s. So you can see that individual leaders actually move over time. And that's why I think it's a misnomer to say populist leaders. They're leaders who use populism, but they're not necessarily populist in their hearts. It's an open question whether they are or not. But the fact of the matter is that they do change their rhetoric over time. You can see massive changes over time. This is Erdogan. The blue is Orban. And now I'm going to show you a few pictures before we end. Okay. And I'm not going to go into the emergence of sovereigntism in Hungary. That's another interesting, fun, process tracing exercise that I think is quite interesting. But okay, these are the billboards that were up in the run-up to the 2018 parliamentary elections in Hungary. And they're basically, here you have, Soros in all of them, right? And here he's working with the political opposition, so members of the political opposition, to break the fence and allow all of these millions of migrants to come into Hungary, right? So it's an elite. He's colluding with the opposition, working together with the EU to bring in all of these migrants. And of course, they're very happy about it. Okay, look how he's smiling. And then you have this classic anti-Semitic image of Soros with as a kind of puppet master, with Botka, who's seen to be a kind of like a Soros stooge, right, doing his bidding, right? Soros, don't let Soros have the last laugh, upper right. Stop Soros. This is the Stop Soros campaign, which also was a national consultation, right? That everybody got to vote on whether they should, Hungary should stop Soros from settling all of these millions of people from Africa and the Middle East into Hungary. So this was every way that these billboards were just papering the streets, they were in the subways, they were on the roads, they were at the bus stops. You could literally, coming up the subway, see all of these Soros posters, one after another. Quite interesting. But it's not just in Hungary. You also have, again, our favorite Ben Garrison, political cartoonist. It's just really gives you a visceral sort of sense of how Soros is working together with the migrants to do this, let's be honest, a great replacement. That's what this image is about, right? Replacing ordinary, hardworking white Americans with all of these migrants from these other countries. This is a kind of an image about how the UK was going to, sail off into the sunset and succeed, this global UK, after having, shed itself from this, EU ballast, right, that was holding it back, right? And so here are my conclusions, right, that populism and nationalism are both sovereigntist orthogonal frames that gain currency during internal and external sovereign crises or threats, right? Like the Great Recession, like the migration crisis, okay? They select for these revisionist foreign policy aims. Nationalism promotes lateral revisionism, populism systemic revisionism, and then you have this increasing articulation of nationalist and populist discourses in what I call ethnopopulism that is characterized by fifth columnist, Trojan horse rhetoric that enables horizontal and vertical in-group, out-group boundary maintenance or omni-revisionism, which can be observed in contemporary US, Turkish, and Hungarian foreign policy and likely many other cases. So I will conclude here and thank you very much.
Hello. Yes. David, do we have mic runners? Yes? Me. You, okay. So we have several minutes for questions, however many Erin can take. So we'll open the floor to questions and then wait for David to come bring a mic to you, but I'll be fielding questions. So Etsuko, do you? Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for the exciting talk. Very almost minor question about your visualization. The way the nationalism and populism works with this space. It was really kind of striking, and I'm just wondering if it also refers to density within the confined space. As the populism takes hold, the dome becomes smaller, and as nationalism takes hold, the width of or the area of the bottom becomes smaller. Does it mean that the inside becomes dense, more dense, therefore more nationalist, more etc. type of thing? Is it implied?
Yeah, that's the implication. It becomes much more homogeneous. That's the imaginary. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Thank you very much. A really fascinating talk. I wanted to ask you whether you could date what you say, this era of globalized sovereignty, and now we have moved on to particularized sovereignties, because I don't think that there was ever a globalized sovereignty era. I mean, we've seen that the US has withdrawn from its global reach, but I don't think there was ever a globalized sovereignty era.
That's a great point. You're right. There has never actually been one world government whatsoever. I think it's better to think about these as ideals, as sort of constructed ideals that we have in our minds as we go and do politics. So when I think about this kind of liberal cosmopolitanism, this kind of globalized sovereignty, I think about, you know, the EU and about so many of the academics who are involved in this kind of global governance, kind of cosmopolitanism sort of project. There are also people who have been involved in this kind of, you know, cosmopolitanism, but also populist sort of sovereign imaginary, where you had this movement for a kind of a more like a proper EU without national boundaries, but that is also kind of involves more like governance is closer to the people. So this DM25 movement, right, that that the people from the Essex School have been involved in. Well, Moffat and Stavrakakis and de Kleen, they're all kind of promoters of this, right? A lot of the sort of, you know, left-wing populist sort of Greek academics, right? So this is their image about what it should look like. But others have focused much more on this, you know, something that looks much more like the EU, that's more globalized, and it could extend out further, that it could include maybe even the entire world. So yeah, was this ever going to happen in real life? Probably not. But I think that this speaks to the power of imaginaries in shaping kind of discourse and in shaping political projects.
First, thank you for your lecture. I really enjoyed it. So I'm a human geographer, so I tend to fetishize the materiality of everything. And I really particularly liked how you used images of billboards and artwork, etc. And I was just wondering how you understand them as pure representations of sovereigntism, etc., or as actually material infrastructures that do something to people, to the demand side, and how much are you trying to use kind of images as actual technologies, not just representations in your work?
This is a tricky question. I would say that I think the interesting point from a policy point of view is where the imagined representations are used to promote or justify, rationalize particular policies that together can bring the actual world closer to the ideal world. And this is what I think that these guys are really doing in politics. This is what Orban has certainly done. His view of, you know, Hungarian ambassadors and civil servants were that they are not actually promoting Hungarian sovereign interests, but rather kind of values, EU values that are not necessarily assistive of the Hungarian sovereign interest. And so he wanted a foreign affairs ministry that is solely focused on this project of bringing sovereignty close to the Hungarian people. I don't know if this helps to answer. On the materiality, I have to think about this a little bit more, but this is kind of where I'm thinking about this kind of intersection between the imaginary and the real is where policy takes shape.
So David, on your left here, no, this way. That. And then back there.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I really enjoyed it. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about the future of migration. I mean, the rise in populism and the revisionist policies, and the classic other is the migrant, the intruder, whether it's internal threat or external threat. And then, I just want to hear more about the future of the liberal state as opposed to the inherent human right, which is the freedom of movement. Thank you.
Well, I don't want I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't think any academics do. And if they claim they do, they would be lying and maybe get themselves into trouble. I suppose I think that we're in for a sort of a winter of liberalism, a time when these ideals are not really resonating with a core group of people who have managed to kind of elect certain leaders who are promoting very illiberal policies. So in this very building, you have the Democracy Institute, which is a vestige of CEU. And I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the CEU story, but you know, we had to leave Hungary because of this campaign here that I sort of showed you, and what's left behind are parts of CEU that are not involved in degree programs, so to comply with the legislation that the Hungarian government passed. And this Democracy Institute they've got this whole big project on illiberalism, the study of illiberalism. So illiberalism actually as an ideology. So, you know, it's got the funding of a Horizon 2020 project. I can see people who are involved in this project in this room. And I think there's a reason that everybody wants to study illiberalism now and not liberalism, because liberalism is on its back feet. It is in a purely defensive position. There's nothing that liberals are offering that is really exciting anybody, including their most obvious constituents. So I don't think that that's always going to be like that. I think that things change, right? We're in an illiberal moment. We're in a hyper-nationalist moment. We're probably going to have to live through some really bad times until such terrible things happen that maybe smarter minds will come together and say, hey, actually liberalism is really kind of the best approach that we have for sort of governing populations that are heterogeneous, and, you know, societies that include people of all kinds of different religions and political beliefs. It's not realistic, and it promotes conflict to try to homogenize ideologically societies. And I think that this is what they're going to find, that it does lead to epic failures. And in the chaos that comes after epic failures come opportunities. That's my hope.
And we had the yellow jacket there on the end. Yep.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's really interesting, lots of things to think about. Just one point about relations between the sovereigntists in different countries, because I think there is, you know, clear affinity between Trump and Orban. They've been meeting each other quite often. Even before Trump re-election, they have talked very positively about each other, and then it could be extended to other cases, I don't know, Putin and Trump and so forth. I'm just wondering, in theory, sovereigntists should be just concerned about themselves, but we're having this kind of meeting of the minds of global sovereigntists. Is there such a thing as a global sovereigntist movement, and what explains it? I'm just wondering. Thanks.
Right, that's a very interesting question, and I think there's a lot of projects underway on kind of the ways in which what are usually called far-right leaders are sort of supporting one another. You had this effort by Bannon to create a kind of an institute of right-wing populism, I think somewhere in Italy. I think this was the plan to create and to promote this kind of movement of far-right leaders that would be kind of coming together in order to promote a wider global far-right agenda. So, and then of course you have the party family in the European Parliament that is, you know, full of right-wing parties across Europe. So there are natural coalitions that have formed for sure. But that said, when it comes to, I mean, they're not going to be allied in the same ways that, you know, democratic countries have been traditionally allied with one another, right? You know, for the last, you know, century, more than a century, the UK and the US, for example. Not a whole lot of light between these two countries in their, you know, foreign policy establishments. But when it comes to these types of leaders, it is very transactional. There is an effort to take every single policy and filter it through this kind of calculus of, does this policy help us first and foremost, rather than kind of this me and my allies. I think the whole concept of allies is different from the ways in which we traditionally think of allies, where we're coming to one another's aid, right? We're going to make sacrifices when our allies are in need in order to protect them. I don't think that this is the kind of calculus that these types of leaders have. And I think that Balint Magyar and Madlovich, they have also written about this notion of kind of this hyper-transactionalist set of foreign policy leaders where you aren't necessarily going to have friends for very long. Friends are ephemeral, right? Friends are basically there for any given situation, but we could just as easily throw them under the bus. And this is another way in which this type of leadership is fundamentally, I think, not really serving any of our interests.
Thank you. I'm going to abuse my position, and then we'll come back to hands here. Just to ask, I mean, you talked about a combination of sort of idealist demand and supply side, you know, approaches, and you also said you had done some research with Trump supporters, and I wonder.
In my family.
And so I'm just wondering if you have a sense a bit more about the demand side, about, you know, why are these messages falling on fertile soil? Because I would say the presentation is more on the ideas and the supply. So, and is it the same in Hungary as it is in the USA in terms of what's the receptivity to the messages?
Well, I think first and foremost, so I have so much to say about this because I just came back from Arkansas, you guys, visiting my family in Arkansas, which isn't even where my family's from, but they're living there now because that's a nice state and it's got low taxes. So, you know, and I was able to watch the Liberation Day chaos and the aftermath. You guys are familiar with the announcement of these tariffs in every country in the world. In this big, huge cardboard cutout type of thing. And I was able to kind of watch this with my family on the news. And, you know, they are like happy, you know. they are like maybe slightly concerned that, okay, I don't know what sort of short-term costs this is going to mean for, you know, whether we'll be able to get, you know, an iPhone for a reasonable price, for example. But the view, at least from Arkansas, from this one family, is, you know, like, okay, there's short-term pain, but in the longer term, everything is going to be way better. Prices will go down. The manufacturing jobs are going to come back. The U.S. is going to reclaim its economic greatness of the 1950s. And, you know, all this stuff that's happening in the universities, you know, they went too far with this DEI stuff, and there's attacks on Jewish students, very anti-Semitic, and this guy, the Maryland father, who was, you know, rendition to El Salvador, he wasn't even an American citizen. And, you know, we don't, you know, like, first of all, we can't really do much because it's El Salvador, you know, so, and anyway, like, you know, maybe you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet kind of thing. But for the most part, there isn't a lot of focus on politics. It's sort of like, you know, Donald Trump is in charge. He's got our back. He's, you know, going to protect our sovereign interests. And it's going to be good. And so they don't necessarily focus on the minute details of policy. It's sort of like, you know, he's got it covered. We don't really like how he talks. He's very crude and, you know, don't like this type. We love everybody. You know, you hear this a lot. We love everybody. I hear that all the time. We love everybody. And I think that people that I have known who are Fidesz supporters are kind of a little bit similar, you know, kind of like, well, you know, Soros did sort of make himself into a political target. You know, he was the one who put himself on the political map, you know. And all this gender stuff, didn't it kind of go a little bit too far, you know, this kind of gender ideology, you know. And shouldn't we try to avoid, you know, joining the war in Ukraine? That's a big risk, right? We don't want that, right? It's better that we kind of, you know, Vitya has got our interests at heart. He's going to prevent us from getting into a war. He's going to keep the price of oil low. That's a big concern, gas and oil. So I think that's how I understand how people look at it from the inside who are supporting. I don't know if this is answering your question. Probably.
Yes, I mean, I have the sense that some deeper, you know, national sentiment and responses to neoliberalism, globalization, other things are creating a disposition that goes deeper than these kind of surface rationalizations.
Oh no, for sure. I think that for sure this is driven by very strong feelings that the world is coming apart, that the nation is coming apart, that they don't recognize the country anymore, and this is the source of these calls to take the country back, to take the nation back. So I think that there is this also strong belief that, you know, the opposition in the case of Hungary, the Democrats in the case of the US, were really taking the country in the wrong direction. And their interests were not being heard. Nobody cares about real Americans / Hungarians, you know. And so this is a kind of a reversion to a better type of leadership that will kind of create an infrastructure to elevate the in-group on the international stage. So that's how I would answer that.
Thanks. Just as I stepped in there, a whole bunch of hands came up here, so if people can put up their hands again. In the back row, hand held high. Yeah, and then we'll come forward.
Thank you for your wonderful talk today. I have a question in two parts. So there are two questions, but I believe they are related. So you talk about sovereigntist frames gaining currency during internal / external sovereign threats, right? How do you reconcile your conception of how nationalism influences foreign policy with the arguments of constructivist IR scholars such as Alex Wendt, who have argued that foreign policy is always a function of national identity, which in turn is imagined, socially constructed, like very much along the lines of the Charles Taylor version of social imaginary that you talked about. So that's from the IR side, and then also what do you think about Billig's argument of banal nationalism, which is again that it's not just about threat situations, but nationalism is something that is ever present and very much normalized and naturalized. So two parts, but sort of the same question.
Great question. That's awesome. So I fully agree with both Wendt and Billig. I think that what you're describing is what he calls banal nationalism, the kind of the everyday sort of uninteresting because it's always kind of there type of nationalism, the folks who have done work on everyday nationalism. So this is great work. This is not in any way meant to undermine this work. It's just to say, I think the liberal nationalism could fit the kind of the Wendtian sort of construction, which, by the way, he got this from the Turner and Tajfal social identity theory. So he kind of drew it from the same sort of, body of social psychology work that, I'm drawing from, right? the world is fundamentally nationalist. We kind of know that. The very notion of nation state is founded in nationalism. This idea that, you know, there is a kind of a territory that belongs to a territorialized people, that's nationalism. So the difference that I'm trying to highlight here is a kind of like, what happens when populism combines with this notion of nationalism? And what about hyper-nationalism, the kind of hot nationalism that Billig talks about, right? This is the kind of the waved rather than the unwaved flags, right? And what does that look like differently from the ordinary, normal, kind of like the liberal nationalist world that we're used to living in? Does that answer your question? Sort of.
There were a couple of hands in the row in front of the fellow who just talked, who just asked a question. Can we take these together, and then I think we will move towards a conclusion. David has some general instructions to the assembled about the space we're in, but on you go, both of you, if you could.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. Just a very short question. What
Can you
makes
put up
some...
your hand so I can see you?
Oh.
Yes.
So what makes someone a revolutionary chief executive? Is it a role taken in time of crisis, or is it a authoritarian personality, or something else? Just that.
That's a great question. Thank
And
you.
we'll just follow on with...
Yes. Oh, the second one, yes.
Yeah, cheers. Thank you so much for the fascinating talk. For better or for worse, I think we're all awake now this time of morning. I was fascinated by the data that you'd drawn on different sorts of populist terminology used in sorts of speeches. I wondered if you could speak a little bit more to how that data was gathered and to what it focused on, to if there were particular terms you were looking for, particular language included, excluded. And I suppose in a larger sense, I was also wondering if you could speak a bit more about communicative mediums that you've studied and how these sorts of leaders access their populist audience. This had come up at one or two times that we're sort of here. You see these billboards, these messages, slogans, very short, bulleted, to the point sorts of things. And I'm wondering if part of this discussion doesn't focus on the fact that liberalism, leftism isn't maybe competing in this same arena very well, right? Both in the sense of adverts and slogans, but also not really reaching out to an audience in this widespread way. And just wondering if you could speak a bit more about how certain communicative avenues influence what you've done here. Thank you so much.
Okay. Wow, that was a big question, but I'll start with a little one. Not little in terms of importance, but, you know, more manageable. So by revolutionary, I'm kind of using this as a term for populist leaders, right? Because this is kind of how I understand populism, is that it's fundamentally revolutionary. Even if the leaders themselves are not actually trying to do revolution, they're talking revolution, and specifically political revolution, right? So it is about the kind of the internal self-determination. Is there internal self-determination? Is there internal sovereignty? Or has it been fundamentally penetrated by elites? Maybe they're liberal elites, maybe they're establishment elites, maybe they're capitalist elites that are hijacking the institutions and therefore preventing the popular will from being reflected in policy. So this revolution, these populist leaders are basically calling for a revolution in political affairs that can help this group of people basically have a greater say in policy. This is at least how they talk, right? And how they even name themselves, right? And their movements are usually very clearly movements, right? Their parties are movements, right? And they're usually kind of large, kind of movement-based parties that are aimed at this kind of ultimate goal. So about our methods of measurement, I'm happy to talk to you in more detail. I don't want to like take everybody's time with all the minute details of this. Suffice to say that we're using the rubrics that have been developed by Kirk Hawkins, who's actually at the Democracy Institute here. You can go knock on his door, and I'm sure he'd be happy to talk to you. This is coming from him, and he basically draws on the literature and populism in order to come up with a method of measuring populist discourse holistically, meaning to kind of capture the inner sort of message that is being communicated in a speech, and it's made up of 3 parts. So one is sort of the pro-people, and the second is anti-elite, and the third is this Manichaean understanding of the world, that it's like the good people versus the evil elites, and you have to actually fight. You can't sort of do bargaining. You can't do ordinary politics. You have to get rid of them completely. So this is where the revolutionary elements of populism come into play. And this rubric basically follows the principles of educational kind of psychology that it kind of maps onto how instructors grade essays, right? To kind of give a sense of whether an essay is an A or an A minus or a B, sort of in the same way you're looking for the salience of each of these elements in the speech. But I'm happy to talk about that more to you in person if you like. About the question about populism in different media, I think it's a fascinating one. I myself am only kind of beginning to work with visual media, and so I couldn't give you a super well-informed answer to that, but I absolutely agree with you that that billboards couldn't be coded in the same way that we're coding kind of speeches, which are extremely long and, you know, goes into detail about sort of the ideology that's sort of embedded into the speech. In these billboards, you're going to have to use different sort of methods in order to really extract much bigger messages from, you know, the use of colors and the use of symbols and imagery. So I think the aesthetics turn in IR might be one place to go, but then there's a whole also media studies field that is dedicated to this. So I would defer to anyone in this room who's doing work on that also.
Okay, well, I think Erin will be happy to talk to people in person as the conference goes on. But with that, I think we should say thank you to Erin and Jenne for our talk.